Hello and welcome to Thoughtcast, the video product from The Hindu, which brings you the latest news and analysis linked to our opinion pages. I'm Narayan Lakshman, opinion editor of The Hindu and senior associate editor here. I'm very pleased to be bringing you in this fifth episode of ThoughtCast a conversation with Professor Alan Lichtman of American University. He serves there as Distinguished Professor of History. And today we'll be looking at the all-important question of how the conviction of former President Donald J. Trump matters in American politics and how it might influence the outcomes in the election that is coming up in November.
I'm Narayan Lakshman. I'm Senior Associate Editor of The Hindu, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Professor Alan Lichtman, a Distinguished Professor of History from American University in the US and an expert on American politics, all things constitutional, and much, much more. I must say that I had the privilege of hearing and even maybe speaking to Professor Lichtman many years ago when I was a US correspondent for The Hindu based in Washington, D.C., and he had come to the Foreign Press Center to address many of us journalists. And I always found his addresses very insightful, enlightening, and so it's a great privilege to have you here today, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So just a quick background question to kind of kick things off in the US politics context. We saw that former President Donald J. Trump was convicted in the hush money case. And I guess the question on the minds of everyone, especially maybe those who don't know the US political system that well, is how does this impact both Republicans as well as Democrats this close to an election? Could you spell out the broad contours of what this case and the conviction mean for both sides?
Well, this conviction is truly unprecedented. We have never before in over 230 years of US history had either a former president or a major party presidential candidate, for that matter, even indicted for felonies, much less convicted of felonies. I have my own prediction system, as you know, for calling the results of presidential elections, the 13 keys to the White House, which essentially tap into the structure of how elections work, which is votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. But this conviction is outside the parameters of the keys. Right. And the keys are a very robust system. They go all the way back retrospectively in development to 1860, and prospectively I've predicted every election since 1984. But it's certainly possible that an event so unprecedented and so cataclysmic outside the context of the incumbent party could have an influence on the election. And I do believe that this conviction could well have that kind of an impact. Certainly, I think voters are going to pause and saying, do we really want to send a multiple convicted felon to the White House? Now, forget all these, instant polls. It's much too early to assess the effect of the convictions. It's going to be played out over weeks and months, and at least we need to hold our analyses until the sentencing hearing on July 11th.
Right. That's really insightful, especially what you said about the 13 keys. And I do remember hearing about them all those years ago. It would be of great interest to our viewers and listeners if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about these predictive factors that you have so finely honed over the years and have used to actually, predict who's going to enter the White House. We could make sense of even those factors in this election, right? They would apply.
Correct. Yes, I developed the keys to the White House in 1981 in collaboration with the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction and mathematical modeling of Vladimir Kailas Borak. And we reconceptualized presidential elections not as Carter versus Reagan, remember this is 1981, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, but in geophysical terms, as stability, the White House party holds power continues, and earthquake, the White House party is thrown out of power. And with that in mind, we looked at every American presidential election since 1860, and that yielded the 13 keys to the White House, which are simple integral parameters expressed as true-false questions where an answer of true always favors stability, an answer of false favors earthquake. And we developed a simple decision rule. If 6 or more of the keys are false, that is, if there are 6 strikes against the White House party, they're a predicted loser, otherwise they're a predicted winner. And the keys tap into the strength and performance of the White House party. They're things like incumbency, internal party contest, midterm election results, long and short-term economy, social unrest, scandal, policy change, foreign policy success and failures, and only 2 keys have anything to do with the candidates, and they're very high threshold keys relating to whether the candidates are those once-in-a-generation inspirational candidates like Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan. I've made no final prediction yet on the keys, but I have said that a lot would have to go wrong for Joe Biden to lose this election. And this is independent of anything that involves Trump's convictions. This is based on the keys. Right now, Biden is down 2 keys. 4 more keys would have to fall to predict his defeat. And the keys your listeners should be tracking as we get closer to the election are third party, social unrest, foreign policy failure, and foreign policy success.
Okay. That's really interesting. I'm going to come back to the foreign policy, especially because obviously our viewers in India will be watching that closely. I do remember one line from one of the talks you gave at the Foreign Press Center all those years ago, and that is that Americans care very much about the character of their president or their presidential candidates. They attribute a lot of weightage to that factor when voting. How would you sort of, again, draw the landscape of the characters of the 2 men in contention in this election? How do you see them, or how do you think voters would size them up?
Well, there's no comparison. Whatever you may think of Joe Biden, you may think he's, maybe old, and that could be an issue. His character is beyond reproach. Republicans have been searching for years to try to find something, anything to smear Joe Biden with, and they've come up absolutely empty. In fact, their so-called smoking gun witness who claimed that Biden had taken a bribe from Ukraine when he was vice president was arrested by the FBI for lying to the FBI, and it turns out what he was propagating in his lies was Russian propaganda. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is the most flawed candidate we've ever seen in terms of his character. As I said, no major party candidate before has ever been indicted for a crime. He's been convicted for 34 felonies. And let's not forget his civil cases. He was found by a jury in a civil case to have sexually assaulted and hurt E. Jean Carroll and defamed her. Another civil case found that he had committed massive fraud in his real estate operations. His charity was found to be a scam that he used for personal enrichment. Trump University, Trump Institute, all imploded. In another criminal trial, not Trump personally, but his company was found to have committed financial fraud. We've never seen and leaving aside the fact that quite credibly he had sex with a porn star when his wife was taking care of his infant child, had an affair with a former Playboy bunny, and that he has mimicked Hitlerian rhetoric, calling for a unified Reich, saying his opponents were vermin, saying immigrants were poisoning the blood of the country, threatening to wreak havoc on his opponents. I don't think we've ever had a more clear contrast in character.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. And I guess that leads to my next question, which is, despite these character flaws, it looks like, at least some of the polls, which you did caution us against believing wholeheartedly, some of the polls do give him an edge, apparently, in some of the swing states, especially. So do you think, again, I know I'm coming back to the conviction, but those independent and undecided voters in swing states, who are often the ones who really make the difference in the electoral college, do you think they would be swayed in terms of character?
There are some new polls that just came out this morning showing that in most of the critical swing states, Trump lead has evaporated, and they are essentially tied. Other polls indeed show that independent voters, which earlier had favored Trump, are now favoring Biden. Now, as you know, I say take these early polls with a huge grain of salt. You know, they have no predictive value. But certainly Donald Trump has to worry as the weeks and months go on, and it sinks in the implications of this conviction, particularly when he has a sentencing hearing, that this could well be the kind of thing that would give independent voters pause about voting for Trump. But I have to say, you know, Trump has had the most remarkable odyssey we've ever seen through American politics. You know, he has survived scandal after scandal that would have utterly destroyed any other political figure. Other political figure would even have survived the allegations in, I don't call it the hush money trial and the election fraud trial, much less a conviction. A few years ago, one of the most promising Republican nomination candidates was a guy named Herman Cain, and a few women simply accused him of sexual harassment. No trial, no criminal charges, no civil charges either, and he was gone instantly.
Yep, I remember that. Yep. But, you know, the surprising thing, Professor, is that, you know, when Trump first burst upon the scene and he won the White House, people almost attributed to him a movement. It was, you know, loosely it was called Trumpism, and in a more substantive context, it stood for, you know, the angry white middle America who were upset that jobs had been offshored to China, and so there was some sort of substantive basis there. But at the same time, it very quickly degenerated into, you know, dog whistles for racism, for anti-minority attitudes, for all those vicious things that the movement and Mr. Trump himself indeed started articulating. So what happens? We've looked at what independents and Democrats might think, but what about his own base, the movement that he unleashed in 2016? Do you think that's still sort of bubbling to the top, and, you know, it has a lot of teeth in American politics?
Absolutely. I would warn anyone listening that Trumpism will survive Trump. I wrote a whole book about this called 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump. There are a lot of holes in our democracy that Trump has exploited. And the Republican Party is now a Trumpist party. You know, some of the commentators talk about, you know, mainstream Republicans. Well, who are they? They're gone. Look at the way every prominent Republican leader has lined up behind Trump's lie that he was unjustly convicted, that the election was rigged, that Joe Biden was behind it. Joe Biden didn't convict Donald Trump. His political enemies didn't convict Donald Trump. A jury of 12 ordinary Americans convicted Donald Trump, and neither Trump nor any of his allies have pointed to anything that was unfair about that trial. If anything, the judge bent over backwards to be deferential to Donald Trump. And yet all these Republican leaders, top to bottom, have lined up behind the lie that this was a rigged, unfair trial and Donald Trump was unfairly convicted. So don't expect the Republican Party to change once Trump is gone from the scene.
Well, that's an interesting point as well, because I think that begs the question of future leadership as well. And in a sense, you know, I don't want to sound ageist here, but on both
Please
Democrats,
don't. I'm 77.
No, I don't think I'm a spring chicken either. I'm, you know, I'm well past middle age. But is there a dearth of powerful leadership? Like, look, even at the start of the turn of the century, you saw George W. Bush whether you liked him or disliked him, he was young. He was more from Texas than from Washington, and he kind of burst on the scene, and all the politics that unfolded happened, the war and so forth, and 9/11. And similarly, years later, President Obama was again considered a bit of an outsider to Washington, but he was again relatively young and he had fresh ideas. It almost seems like, alternating between now Biden and Trump, not about the age so much, but is there a lack of, buoyant, fresh, energized leadership, whatever its age, on either side?
Well, there's no real correlation between age and leadership. Who is the iconic conservative Republican president? Their oldest president, Ronald Reagan, right? Who was in his 70s when he finished his second term in office. Who is the iconic liberal Democratic president? Franklin Roosevelt. Not quite as old as Ronald Reagan, but in a different time. He was in his 60s when he passed away at the beginning of his final term. So, but I do think we're at an inflection point in politics. I do think, after this election, you're going to see a wave of new, younger leadership on both sides of the aisle. I can't tell you which leaders will emerge at this point, but this is the inflection point. This is the last hurrah, both for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, one way or the other.
Right. And speaking of leadership again, there is a sense that over the last many decades, American voters and the American public have been bitterly polarized over a number of issues. We all know many of them well. They include reproductive rights, immigration, the economy, and even some areas of foreign policy. Whoever occupies the White House next, what sort of chances would you give them towards being able to build a bipartisan bridge and actually find a resolution to some of these very thorny problems?
I have to correct what is the common wisdom about polarization on these issues. There is polarization among the political leaders who benefit from the polarization, but there isn't polarization among the American people themselves. You mentioned reproductive rights. Well over 60% of Americans agree. That's a pretty hefty consensus that abortion should always or usually be available. The pro-life position is a very small minority position. On immigration, there is widespread consensus among the American people that we need comprehensive immigration reform that includes both border security and a path to citizenship for certain types of undocumented immigrants. And on the economy, I think what voters really care about is we want a robust economy that helps us economically, whatever the policy.
Size of business, size of government, and role of government in the economy is what I meant.
They don't really care so long as, look, here's the great paradox of American politics I'll share with you. People hate their government. We have this tradition in America of rugged individualism. We don't want to be regimented by government. But on the other hand, they love all the benefits of government. Us senior citizens, we're not giving up our Medicare and our Social Security. The young people are not giving up their scholarship grants. The people in the hurricane path are not giving up their disaster assistance. So that's the great paradox of American politics. But again, I stress, and this is very sad, that our leadership exaggerates the extent of polarization that exists within the electorate. So, if we can get another Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, I do think there is room for bipartisan agreement on the most important issues facing the country. Whether we have that kind of leadership is an open question.
Yeah. Has President Biden tried to do that in his previous term? Did he not try to reach out to Republicans over certain issues,
has.
even immigration?
Despite the media and the punditry's focus on polarization, In fact, Biden has achieved a greater list of domestic policy accomplishments than any president since the 1960s in 60 years. You know, the CHIPS bill, the stimulus bill, even a modest gun control bill, the bill on climate change and taxation, the bill helping disabled veterans. It's an incredible series of accomplishments, but unfortunately, most Americans not aware of it, because while Biden has been very good in racking up accomplishments despite polarization, he has been terribly deficient in messaging. And Democrats have really had a messaging deficit for a very long time.
That's so interesting. And final question, Professor, is regarding what you said in your 13 keys about foreign policy as well. And obviously, while not every American might vote on the basis of foreign policy, the question looms large in front of America. That on the one hand, you have competition from China. On the other hand, you have Russia doing what it does. And there are very difficult questions in the immediate future in terms of the Israel-Gaza crisis and the impact you've seen in U.S. universities, and of course the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So where does America stand in terms of dealing with these? Because under Trump's government, it almost seemed to take a step back, but under President Biden, it appeared to re-engage with the world community and accept its role at the head of various global institutions and the leadership it provided there. So where does America stand in this regard in terms of a future administration?
Well, it depends who wins the presidency. You know, we've seen this movie before. Donald Trump's America First approach to foreign policy simply mirrors what we saw from the America First movement, same name, prior to World War II. When the America First movement said, you know, we have no interest in what's going on abroad. Doesn't matter if Hitler conquers Europe. You know, we can survive anyway, and we should look to America first. And that's the same kind of policy that, you know, Donald Trump is championing today. So I think in some ways, as much as domestic policy, there is a very important decision for the American people to make. Do we want to stay engaged the way we have really since the beginning of World War II and understand, you know, we live in an interdependent global world, or are we going to turn inward back to the old American First ideology? I happen to believe that the majority of Americans understand that we do need to be engaged with the world, but, you know, there is still this very powerful strain of America First isolationism that has a lot of historical roots in America.
Right. And do you think that if, let's just as a hypothetical look at Trump coming back, do you think he could continue such a policy of America First? Because on the one hand, you've seen for example, the Israel-Gaza crisis, it has echoes on US campuses. If you look at Russia, Ukraine, NATO is under serious threats. Two new members have joined NATO, and Russia is making noises about the use of nuclear weapons. And there is a palpable sense of tension along the Russian border there. So do you think even if Trump came back, he could actually turn the dial back to the isolationist model or the America First model?
I think it would be very difficult to go back to, old-fashioned, two oceans protect us kind of isolationism. But, it's very hard to know what Donald Trump is going to do. He changes what he says in 10 minutes. But I do think we may see, not full-blown isolationism, but a real dialing back of America's engagement in the world, less cooperation with NATO and our allies, perhaps an unwillingness to provide continuing aid to Ukraine. The Middle East is a separate issue that involves all kinds of things that are unique to that region and, the views of the various religions. But generally, I think there will be a dialing back, if not a return to, 1920s isolationism or 1940 America Firstism.
Absolutely. Okay, Professor, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm grateful for your insights. I'm sure our viewers will also enjoy hearing these and feel enlightened by them. Thank you once again for joining us.
So with that, we wrap up the discussion on American politics, the Donald Trump conviction, and the election that is most exciting, but will also have major implications, not only for the US, but across the world in terms of foreign policy. Professor Alan Lichtman has explained to us how, through his predictive model of understanding who will win these elections, he was able to analyze the current scenario, looking at economic policy, looking at foreign policy, and looking at the popularity of the two candidates, the incumbent Joe Biden and the challenger Donald J. Trump. In this regard, we have talked about how it matters that each president has a rather different character background, and the American voters are, of course, polarized, and some have a strong preference for liberal progressive leaders and the others for conservatives, such as Mr. Trump. Will this election actually see an opportunity for bipartisanship, or will there only be more polarization, leading to greater divisions in American society and politics, and of course, across the important policy issues that we looked at in this discussion?
If you want to follow my insights on American politics and where the keys to the White House stand, check out my live show every Thursday at 9 p.m. DC time. That's 9 p.m. Eastern time. And you can find it by checking in at Alan Lichtman YouTube. At Alan Lichtman YouTube, 9 p.m. every Thursday DC time.